Do you own a firearm? Are you thinking about selling it? Watch out. The ATF may have just labeled you an unlawful arms dealer if you don't have a federal firearms license in order to sell your self-defense firearms. And if you don't get one, you could end up facing prison. Seriously? Well, according to the ATF, as soon as May of 2024, if you choose to sell any of your self-defense firearms, you could be looking at a federal crime that could face prison time if you don't have a federal firearms license. Okay, let's start by breaking all of this down. When you look at what the ATF claims here, they're claiming they want to provide some direction on the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is Public Law 117-159 of the 117th Congress. What they're really trying to do here, supposedly, is to shut out or close the gun show loophole. Now look, here's the problem with the 2022 Safer Communities Act. Essentially what it did is it expanded 18 U.S.C. 921 regarding the definition of who is required to obtain a federal firearms license. In layman's terms, that basically means the federal government is wanting to expand their control over who they allow to sell their firearms. Okay, let's start by looking at law enforcement and government's position on this new law and their new regulation. The ATF is claiming this rule is only in place now so that they can require the people that Congress wanted to regulate as a licensed firearms dealer to be in compliance with the law under the 2022 Safer Communities Act. In other words, the actual law states that, quote, those that engage in the business of selling guns for profit must actually follow the federal law that requires both a background check and a valid federal firearms license. Look, this is nothing new. The law already says that firearms dealers are required to do valid background checks and they must have a federal firearms license. But as always, watch out for the government, because what they are claiming is that this black market has developed out in our communities where people are able to get access to firearms that lead to community violence. Here's the problem. Anytime the government shows up claiming they want to help me, I'm very suspicious because I'm concerned they're going to take away some of my actual privacy rights and my constitutional rights. In fact, the current ATF director admitted as such that in an effort to close the gun show loophole, he stated that the ATF wants to expand the government's control and reach to anyone and everyone they believe meets the definition of an actual firearms dealer.
The law that Congress passed, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which changed the definition, expanded the definition of those engaged in the business, applies to people who are doing that conduct no matter where they're doing it. And that you're not allowed to break the law that Congress passed just depending on whether you're doing it out of your trunk or whether you're doing it at a gun show or whether you're doing it on a new social media platform.
Here's the weird thing about all of this, though. This entire rule does not apply to any buyer of a firearm. Only the seller. I'm not sure how the government thinks they're going to stop community violence if a buyer can still go buy whatever they want, but here it's really clear the ATF is going after any seller of a firearm. Okay, but how does this really affect you? One of the issues with the Safer Communities Act is that it changed the law to say that you no longer have to actually be making a living in gun sales in order to be considered engaging in the business of gun sales. Now I'm going to refer back to 27 CFR 478 for a second, and I want you to understand something real quick. Here's the deal. In other words, previously under 27 CFR 478, to be seen as a gun dealer, you had to be selling firearms with, quote, the principal objective of livelihood and profit. However, under the 2022 Safer Communities Act, Congress changed the definition of a gun dealer as meaning now that you engage in business of guns if you, quote, devote time, attention, and labor, end quote, to sell a firearm, quote, to predominantly earn a profit, end quote. What does predominantly earn a profit mean? It means, and I'm going to read it verbatim, it means, quote, the intent underlying the sale or disposition of firearms is predominantly one of obtaining pecuniary gain. A person may have the intent to profit. Now check this out. They may have the intent to profit even if the person does not actually obtain the pecuniary gain from the sale. Think about how crazy this is. The ATF is now going to look in to see not only if you actually made a profit by selling your firearm to someone else, but if you intended to make a profit on that sale. This is scary stuff here. I mean, who doesn't intend to make a profit? When's the last time you tried to sell anything without the hopes of making some type of profit from it? The point of the matter is this: if you wanted to make a profit on the sale of your self-defense firearm, even if you didn't, the ATF is now going to label you a gun dealer. This is the problem. I'm sure Congress thought they were doing the right thing by passing the so-called Safer Communities Act. But the reality of it is federal agencies can then institute and create these rules as to how they're going to enforce the law, and that can really end up costing you your freedom. We all know that if you're selling guns in a gun shop, you have to have a valid federal firearms license, and you have to actually run background checks. But what if you just want to sell your personal self-defense firearm to someone else and you want to upgrade your current weapon? This is where the ATF gets sneaky and tricky with you, because what they claim is that if you sell a firearm with the intent to purchase a firearm in the future, then you may now qualify as a dealer under their new regulations. That would mean if you wanted to sell your personal self-defense firearm to upgrade, you now have to have a valid federal firearms license and you have to run somebody's background check. Come on, man. I mean, think about how crazy this is. Oh, by the way, if you don't do it, then you could actually potentially face prison time. We all know that the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution provides us the right to bear arms. And one of the primary reasons our founders put that in place was so that we could defend ourselves. If you're like many people, including myself, there are times when you will buy but also sell your self-defense firearms. What's the risk under this new regulation? Well, what if your gun is lost or stolen and then the police recover it and they trace it all the way back to the point of sale and find out you were involved? Now you run the risk the police could come to you, the ATF could claim, all right, show me proof you ran a background check and you have a valid federal firearms license because we have now labeled you a gun dealer. This same situation could also happen if you sell your self-defense firearm to someone else. And then what if a situation arises where they need to use the gun in self-defense and now the police seize the weapon, which they commonly do, and then they track it back to the point of sale and they find out you are the one who sold the gun to the person who used it in self-defense. Now, once the ATF comes up to you and they find out that you were the one who supposedly sold the gun, they're going to start asking you questions, which you have a right to remain silent, by the way. But if they do, is it possible now they're going to force you to prove that you ran background checks with this person and that you also had a valid federal firearms license? In theory, yes. Finally, God forbid, but what if you sell your gun to someone that you trusted, but then they turn around and they use that gun in some sort of crime? You can bet on the fact that that prosecutor is going to run that same trace to find out who had previously owned that weapon. And if they can link it back to you, you can guarantee that you will now have a target on your back from the ATF for being an unlicensed gun dealer. Notice the problem here. The ATF's approach to the Safer Communities Act essentially places you under a criminal investigation and possible arrest for merely selling your gun. You didn't do anything wrong. It was an innocent sale, and it's not like you're out there selling guns for your profession or for a living. Let's be real here. What the real goal is of the ATF is they are trying to force all private sales of guns to be done through gun stores and through no other resource. But what if you go to a gun show? It gets even worse when you start talking about attending a gun show. First of all, if you sell your gun for cash at a gun show, don't forget the ATF has been known to attend these gun shows. In reality, the way that the ATF has drafted these rules, any person who goes to a gun show in order to sell their personal self-defense firearm or exchange it for someone else, try to barter it, is now potentially under investigation by the ATF as being an illegal arms dealer. What about online marketplaces like Craigslist or GunTrader? You can guarantee that the ATF is going to start hanging out in these forums looking to see if they can find anyone who is trying to sell a personal self-defense firearm so that they can place them under a criminal investigation for potentially being an illegal arms dealer. Now, what if you do buy and sell an extensive amount of firearms? What if you have a large collection of firearms? You should get ready for one of two things that's going to happen from the ATF. Number one, get ready for a possible letter from the feds telling you that they are investigating and believe that you may be engaging in illegal arms dealing because of the amount of sales that you're making with firearms. The feds have been known to do this, and many people kind of refer to this as a cease and desist letter, basically putting the sword over your head saying you better stop or else. Or number two, an arrest warrant being issued for you being an illegal arms dealer, you then being arrested and hauled into federal court for a federal crime. But what if the firearm you are selling is part of your private collection? This is an important question because under 27 CFR 478.11, there is an exclusion for personal collections. I mean, if it's my personal collections, we're all good, right? I mean, it seems like it at first. At first glance, everything seems just fine. In fact, here's the exact language. Quote, personal firearms that a person accumulates for study, comparison, exhibition, collecting curios or relics, or collecting unique firearms to exhibit at gun club events, or for a hobby, non-commercial recreational activities for personal enjoyment, such as hunting, skeet, target, or competition shooting, historical reenactment, or non-commercial firearms safety instruction. All good so far until, here's the next part, quote, the term shall not include firearms accumulated primarily for personal protection. What does that mean? The ATF is telling you that any self-defense firearm that you own is not a part of your personal collection. I don't know about you, but that gets my Second Amendment blood boiling when I read that. How dare the ATF just create some arbitrary rule stating that my self-defense firearms are not a part of my personal collection? First, the purpose of the Second Amendment is for my self-defense. But now I'm being told by the ATF that if I want to sell my self-defense firearm, and maybe I want to upgrade it to a different, better firearm, I must now have a federal firearms license and I must offer background checks or risk going to federal prison? Look, this makes me question what is the Second Amendment now? And oh, by the way, who gets to decide whether a firearm is a self-defense firearm or not? What if I had to use a sport gun in a self-defense situation? Does that change that sport gun into a self-defense firearm? Come on, man. Now, a reasonable question would come up here and say, look, Jeff, are there any actual presumptions or exemptions that are a part of these ATF rules? Yes, they are, and let's examine them real quick. Number one, gifting a gun. Now, the ATF says if it's a bona fide gift, then you are presumed not to be an arms dealer. Thanks for that, ATF. Number two, building a gun collection. The ATF has said that you are not considered an arms dealer if you are merely building a gun collection. But don't forget that gun collection cannot involve self-defense firearms. We talked about this earlier, but watch out for this catch-all provision. For example, let's say I'm selling an antique collectible firearm to buy another antique collectible firearm. Well, that's okay according to the ATF because I'm just building my gun collection. But what if I want to sell my Glock to buy a Remington? Nope. Why? Because now that is not considered part of building a gun collection because it is a personal self-defense firearm. Remember, self-defense firearms are completely left out of these exemptions under the rules. What if I don't sell my gun, but instead I barter and trade back and forth one gun for another? Am I okay here? Be careful here because once again, if you're talking about a personal self-defense firearm, you have no protection for bartering one gun for another. So if you go and you try to change or trade out your Glock for a Remington, get ready, the ATF is going to see you as a firearms dealer. Number three, occasional firearms transfers between family. Now the real key to this exclusion is occasional. You can't be, giving a gun to every Uncle Bob and every Aunt Susie that's out there. The ATF is claiming as long as it's an occasional family transfer, then you're exempt. Number 4, selling off your gun collection as long as you have no intention to restock. I know, ridiculous, right? Is the government not telling us exactly what their intention is here? If I want to sell my entire gun collection and I don't want to restock and protect myself in a self-defense situation, no problem. But if I want to sell my gun collection in order to buy other guns, now all of a sudden I'm dangerous and I am going to be labeled a firearms dealer. Like I said a second ago, the ATF is making their agenda very clear here. It's okay to sell all of your guns. Go ahead, dump all of your guns. As long as you don't restock and protect yourself, you're good to go. But if you plan to repurchase, we're going to keep an eye on you and you might end up going to prison. Number 5, a court order to sell your firearms. This one's simple. If the court orders you to sell your firearms, the ATF is saying they're not going to label you a dealer. Number 6, if you're an auctioneer. So here, it makes sense. If you're auctioning off a gun, the ATF is saying they're not going to label you a dealer. You know the problem here? Some poor guy is going to end up selling some friend of his a gun, or maybe a couple of guns. And then he's going to end up being the guinea pig for the ATF to go after them, arrest him, put him in jail, and possibly a federal conviction before we're able to clear up and find out that these rules should be labeled unconstitutional. Why do I say that? Because someone has to have standing, legal standing, in order to challenge these regulations. And very often the courts are going to require someone to end up being that guinea pig and end up being arrested and charged in federal court before we're able to all get clarity on these ridiculous regulations. Now, here's the real question that you should be thinking about. Should you be selling any of your firearms while the ATF is pursuing this mess? Here's what I would be concerned about. I would absolutely be very concerned and careful about selling any of my guns unless I first consulted with a lawyer. But Jeff, wait a minute. What if before I sell my personal self-defense firearm, I make the buyer go do a background check with a licensed FFL in my local community? I'm protected then, right? The simple answer to that is maybe, but let me ask you this. Have you done it only once, or have you done that frequently? Because the ATF could then begin to look and see that if you've done this more than 1 or 2 times, they may now want to label you a dealer. The biggest problem, because I've had people ask me this question, you can argue substantial compliance. You can always do that. But at the end of the day, if you're not a licensed dealer and you're not offering background checks and it's a personal self-defense firearm, the ATF could be coming after you. This brings me to my last point. How will the ATF know whether you made a family transfer, whether you made it as a gift, or you meet one of the exemptions that is listed under the regulations? That is all going to depend on you and whether you choose to talk to the police or what you say to the ATF if they come to your door and start knocking. In fact, what if the ATF shows up at your front door and they come knocking demanding to see your guns? What can you do? Check out this next video where I break down 5 tips whenever cops want to see your guns. See you over there.